Now I want us to go back to Everything's Eventual, which has the story Riding the Bullet in it, which started off as an ebook, of course, but it was actually, Everything's Eventual was the only way I ever really found Riding the Bullet, but even before that, this was one of those cases where I actually saw the movie before I knew anything about the story at all, because the movie, which is brought to us by Mick Garris, who also directed the miniseries for like The Shining and The Stand, among other things. Sleepwalkers, I think, is his also. And as far as the movie goes, which can come in this two-pack with Big Driver, which we'll talk about should we ever get to discussing his novellas, but in the meantime, as far as the movie goes, I actually saw it the night that it premiered on TV, like that very night, and that night just happened to be within a week of, it was like right in the middle of a week where I was the sickest I've probably ever been in my life. So this movie always, I guess because of that, I don't know if it would have been the same otherwise, but because of that, this movie has kind of forever stuck in my mind, and especially with the sort of like almost fever dream-like way I saw it for the first time. And it's ended up being something that I come back to, like, usually every other fall season or so, because it's not a great movie, but it's executed in such an interesting way, and the way that it takes the points of King's story and tries to bring them to life. There were some really great ways they found a way to do that, and others where you can tell they're trying, but you're not sure that it entirely gets the point across. And might seem much better if you are familiar with the story. And the interesting thing about the story, especially the way it was released with the whole ebook thing, was that King talks about, in like the preface before the story in the book, about how whenever he would be like in an airport or something, or around a lot of people, they would be so sort of wrapped up in themselves or whatever they were doing that it wouldn't matter that he was there. Like, it wouldn't matter, like, it comes off less almost arrogant sounding when you actually hear it in his words. But just people were so preoccupied, he didn't have to worry about being mobbed by people. And the only people that he was approached by were, like, husbands whose wives had read all of his books, but the husbands hadn't. And that's pretty much at the place that he was when this came out, apparently. And then the second this story was released electronically, then suddenly everybody was coming after him in public places, and he was getting mobbed by like crowds for autographs and all that other stuff. And the thing that kind of drove him crazy about this is that people were talking about the success of it, and like how many people had potentially read it, or at least had access to it, and nobody was talking about the content of the story. Like, it's almost like nobody even brought up the story itself when talking about the success of it, and that kind of drove him crazy. And you can understand why, because it's really this, like, you can tell it's this really deeply personal story that hits in a way that can hit all of us, because it touches on something that we're all sort of terrified of, whether we talk about it or not. I know specifically me, there's this whole thing about it being like the confronting your family's mortality, particularly your mother's, and then subsequently your own. Something they tried to visualize in the movie with this interesting cemetery scene in his imagination, where it's his father's funeral, and then it like pans up to his mother's funeral, and then it pans up to his own. And there's that little comedic visual gag of his tombstone just says "Who gives a shit?" While being comedic also shows that it's just each death in like your family or anybody close to you is just a stepping stone to your own, and how terrifying that is, that it's this constant stream of that, where it's the death of a parent, or specifically a mother in this case, is something so terrifying and something you spend your entire life dreading, that once that moment comes and the pain comes and it's finally over, not only will that pain never fully go away, but the next thing will always be there, which is your own death. And that's a really heavy thing to touch on in a story that's so out there in the way that it presents itself, almost like in such a sort of traditional horror way. to the extent that I do think it was the right approach that Garros takes. Garros also adapted it to the screenplay format, and the approach that he takes about it basically feeling like a sort of like campy B movie, and he puts a lot of those touches in there, whether it be the movie theater scene when we get George's background, or we get even the menu on this DVD is played up like an old B movie trailer, like a horror movie trailer, which is really interesting. And that's, yeah, the way he executes it. It might sound like those two things don't mesh well together, or like at some point you would lose the heart of it. But the story certainly never loses it, and the movie eventually finds its way back there also. Even if it may seem like it loses its way from time to time, it does manage to find its way back around to what King wanted to say and the point he wanted to get across. So there is that. And now as far as the way it takes, like the opening of the book talks about the shadows in the dark, and basically what exactly it is when you say you're afraid of the dark, where you're afraid of the shadows and like what's lurking in them. And the creepy thing about that is when it's at night, the shadows are worse, and so when you like turn a lamp on, all light does is make more shadows. And so there's like always something in the distance to be afraid of, and that's, yeah, and that's shown to us throughout, like when you think about that, like how your imagination takes over, and whatever your imagination comes up with is what you're actually afraid of. In this particular case, they take that to the fullest extent possible, where a lot of the movie is us seeing what the lead character, Alan, thinks might be coming, or what he might be seeing, before we see what actually happens, or what it actually is. And sometimes that can really work, and sometimes they do it enough to where it can probably get a bit tiresome, but I like that they tried to translate that idea through this way. Does make sense to a certain extent. And then there are some changes you'll notice right away from the story. For instance, the time setting, which is, in the book, I want to say is set in 2000, because I think it's the same, it takes place 2 years after George Staub's death, and his tombstone in this, I believe, says 1998. So, in the movie, we go back to the 60s. I think it takes place in 69. And that might seem like just a random thing to do, but it's surprising how much it actually works. I'm not entirely sure what specifically Garrus wanted out of that, but when you look at it, it's, for starters, when you talk about the imagination stuff and the way we see all the different scenarios that he sees in his mind of what could happen, or what things could be, the way it's like edited and the way some of these scenes look almost kind of gives it this psychedelic vibe in some cases. And then there's the whole thing where we get inclusions of stuff like the Nicky Cat character, when he comes across this supposed hippie and hitches a ride from him before any of the freaky shit starts happening, before he gets some of the more ghostly rides. And it turns out that this guy basically went AWOL after he was drafted, and he's posing as a hippie. And it's like, just little period details like that do work just for the sake of character and the different kind of people you can come across, and it kind of gives you more of a progression of the kind of people he comes across until ultimately it coming to a point when he finally hitches the ride with George Staub. But there's also a moment here when he manages to steal a joint from this character, the hippie character, and that kind of sets something off also, where it's like he takes a few hits off the joint and then he starts seeing stuff, and it becomes this thing of, because there's already, if you even take like the weed aspect out of it, there's always that question of, is what he's seeing real or not? And now you add on to the whole thing of him as a character, he doesn't know if he's high or not in regards to what he's seeing, and if it's, you know, some sort of hallucination or actually there or not. Like, it starts off a little ridiculous, like the talking bird. But then this whole scene in the middle of the road, starting with the talking bird, just evolves into this whole thing of, then he sees the school bus of children go by and all their Halloween masks are in the windows as they drive by. And it's stuff like that that like the very old-fashioned sort of Halloween imagery, stuff like that really works. And then eventually being stalked by this specter-like thing that is apparently his dad, and he gets his dad's backstory eventually. on that. And just this whole scene of him being stalked by like a figure that slowly comes into the light. It's just all kinds of old-fashioned horror imagery that works by itself. If in context it might seem a bit, you know, way too in abundance or way too like it's all over the place. But it to kind of establish the world of he has no idea what he's gonna run into in the dark on this road, and the whole thing of like when they see the moon and there's the whole indication of the moon almost represents that the entire night is evil. So it is those things being used to like completely set up that sort of thing and set him into this world, I think end up working in the long run. But then we also get stuff like the rednecks. The rednecks that tell him, you know, to get a job and all that, which he just mentions in passing in the book. He's like, while I was hitchhiking, some guys told me to get a job because they didn't realize what the story was. He was debating whether he should even use a sign or not. And this turns into a whole scene, like almost an action scene, of him getting chased by these rednecks. And given that the movie's set in '69, I wouldn't be surprised if this is no more than an homage to the ending of Easy Rider. The rednecks where all you have to do is like flip them off and then they will track you down and shoot you. But like I said, that could be seen as padding, because it really seems pointless in the long run, but then it also kind of sets up the whole thing of, is it just part of how evil the night is? Is it something that's supernaturally inclined or not? So I guess it's a very roundabout way of getting to that point, I suppose. Another thing that they sort of added is a few things at the beginning, like the start of the story, because the being in the car with the old man is pretty much the start of the story, and that's like about 30 to 35 minutes into the movie itself. So with setup, he has a girlfriend now who is Erica Christensen, and in the story it doesn't say anything. He says like he lost his virginity once while he was drunk, and that's pretty much the closest contact he's had with a girl. And then there's the whole thing about him being suicidal, and that's actually something they added that I do think brings something to the table, since it's really a whole study in death in general and getting to that point. And it puts his character closer to that sort of thing and how that comes back later. I do think there's something adding to that also. And then that also kind of brings in the old-fashioned horror imagery when he's literally visited by this creepy-looking Grim Reaper when he's sitting in the bathtub contemplating slitting his wrists. And it turns out that this may not have been his first run-in with that Grim Reaper of sorts, whatever the hell he is. It's like the mystery surrounding him is more interesting than if they straight up say, you know, yeah, he's the Grim Reaper. I think he's credited as Grim Reaper, but the fact that he could be anything, I think, is more terrifying. But yeah, and then this addition of him having a conscience that is his physical form, where he basically has, and George even calls this out later. We're not sure if he's an angel on his shoulder, a devil on his shoulder, or some combination of both. But I just take it as he's just his conscience in some way, because the way the story, where we can pretty much see inside his head and the way he thinks about things, if there was ever going to be, this was the best way to do that without going into full-on voiceover, which would have been so corny. And yeah, I would say I would have been more interested to see how they could have done some of this stuff a bit more visually rather than going straight up for making his conscience of being we can physically see in the movie. And obviously he's not physically there in the story, but as far as us being able to see him and know what he's thinking and hear what he's thinking, and the way he debates with himself, there is something to that, I suppose, that it could get those points across that they might have otherwise been lost in the adaptation, and then we wouldn't have been as in his head as we could have been, and thus distance us a little more. So I can see why they do something like that. And then you have this. Oh, you also have his friends that they add. The one friend whose name he uses is in the story, but then there's this whole thing about his girlfriend giving him tickets to John Lennon, and they have a really interesting approach here. Also, when you talk about death and the fear of it, and how it could be really far away or it could be really close, and we'll never really know. But it's played up as a comedic moment, but it actually does add on to that pretty nicely. when they're talking about, their friends are suggesting, what if this concert goes all crazy? Like, what if all the Beatles are suddenly there and it's like a surprise performance? And then they go more into it and they're like, what if, all these people did this? And then it's like, but imagine these people, these rock legends, and what if when they get old, what is that going to be like? And every person, every rock legend that he lists and asks, what's going to happen when they get old? And he lists all of the ones that died young. So like I said, it's played up as kind of a comedic moment, or like I guess a wink at the camera, really. But the way that plays into the whole, where is death in our timeline and we don't know that, there is something to that also. So I do like that they added that, even though other than that, the whole plot line of them going to Toronto for a concert doesn't really add much to anything. I guess it could show the love for his mother and the desperation to get to her that he gives up his tickets to them. I guess once again we're going very roundabout ways to say things that are pretty simple, and it may feel like padding the runtime a little bit, but we get there nonetheless. So really, to me, the parts of the movie that always really stood out, and the ones that I always can't wait to get to whenever I put this movie on, are the scenes with David Arquette when he gets picked up by George Staub and everything that happens from then on. And that in itself, they could have easily made this a really, really effective short film by just doing the George Staub stuff, and maybe the old man right before him, who I did mention is Cliff Robertson in this, by the way, who also has this really interesting, very short turn in this movie before we reach the George scenes, where it's like, I do think the old man scenes work a lot better in the story because of the way they really explain the whole. At times he's sympathetic, then suddenly it can be like really nerve-wracking, and the way they describe the smells and all that, which is all the stuff they do after the fact rather than during in the movie. But it's this back and forth where we're never quite sure, along with him, like, is this guy something else? Is this guy part of the evil of the night, or is it just an old guy that's just all over the place in his mind and has been, hit by tragedy in his life one too many times? And then that whole thing that, once again, is a very relatable thing, where it's like once you get out of a situation like that, your brain constantly wonders if it was overdoing it or not. Like you're not sure if you really should have been afraid of anything or not, and if so, what was it that you were afraid of? Was it a harmless situation, or was your first instinct that something's off right? But then, once we get past that, we do get to the scene where he's picked up by George in a Plymouth, which in the book is a Mustang, but it's clear they wanted to go for the Christine montage. And I believe the only difference is that the Plymouth that George drives in the movie is a 1960, whereas Christine is a 1958. I don't know shit about cars, that is solely the research speaking. So, and then once we have these scenes with George, I like the way that there's still build-up, and it's the same way in the story also, there's still build-up, a natural build-up to the terror of this, despite the fact that there's not really much of a reveal involved. They go all the way in the movie with actually having a picture of David Arquette on George Staub's tombstone, so we know, we can make the connection already, and we see him around throughout the movie, like the Plymouth will drive by, or he'll be standing in a crowd or something. And I like that idea also, just kind of have him constantly lurking. That was kind of a nice addition. But then, once these moments when he's in the car, and the conversation happens very quickly, because we already know what's going on, and it doesn't take Alan that long at all to figure out what's going on also. And there's the stuff they try not to acknowledge, like the fact that his head is clearly stitched together, and so many other things. I like the idea of them wondering what's going on underneath his hat, and the way they play with that, where he has the vision, of course, that it's his bleeding brain underneath, and there's this quick, horrific, almost comedically horrific scene about that. But then there's also the moment afterwards where he doesn't immediately take his hat off and reveal that there's nothing under there. And that it's not actually that. The scene goes a long time, and then finally he just kind of casually takes it off eventually and keeps talking. And, like, there's that moment where you're like, for just just a second, even though even after you already realize that it's not what his imagination was, you still kind of flinch once you realize he's taken his hat off, and stuff like that works really well. And this also works because I mentioned the whole movie theater thing in regards to showing off George's story, which is this really interesting. Like I said, it's almost like it's such an ode to B movies when you look at the whole thing and what he seemed to be going for tonally. And obviously, a lot of this would not work as well if it were not for how great David Arquette is in this. He finds like just the exact sweet spot between being genuinely scary and the tension and the full-on camp factor. Being a character right out of one of those campy B movies. And that's a case where you kind of already have the sense that David Arquette really knows what he's doing and what he's talking about when it comes to the different tones of horror movies. Because obviously not only did he learn from Wes Craven for 4 movies, but he also directed a movie in, I want to say 2007, called The Tripper, which was almost like this, I wouldn't say borderline parody, but it's this very grindhousey sort of slasher movie that's that I find myself recommending a lot to horror fans. So you can tell that he's definitely, horror is an area he knows a lot about, and I feel like a lot of that knowledge went into this performance and finding that balance between genuinely terrifying and a little, maybe not so much a little, on the campy side as well, and finding that perfect middle ground. Like I said, there's that amazing moment when he's keeps talking to his conscience in the car, and they're trying to decide, we can't let George know that we know he's dead, and what if he knows that we know, and so on. And then finally, just before he gets thrown out of the car, George turns to the back seat and says, "Who are you anyway?" And it's like he knew he was there the whole time. I really, really love that moment. So then that pretty much takes us all the way to this climax we get at the park, which is obviously something else that is new to the story. And, yeah, I do think that's another way that when you're doing a movie adaptation and you need some sort of climax, because the ending of the story is so poignant without needing, like, a horror movie or an almost action-y climax to it. Like I said, when you're adapting, you do need to make some of these changes, especially with the tone that you've already set up. So as far as fitting the tone, I feel like this climax pretty much works, especially when you actually put him in the seat on the bullet again, and actually have that whole sequence. That's pretty ingenious, actually, to fit that into the story somehow, especially for a climax. I do think what actually starts to not work so much is the in-between of when we actually get to the poignancy and the climax of the park. This in-between where he gets the ride to the hospital. And the music in this scene sort of takes on a bit more of an upbeat vibe, as if, like, the climax is over, now we're in the easy part. But the thing is that we're not. It's, like, the most terrifying thing in the entire story, and that is when he's under the impression that he's given his mom's life over to George, when he chooses her, when George's whole thing was, you gotta choose between you and your mom, who I'm gonna take with me to God knows where, wherever I came from. And there should be constant terror once he has said take her to when he gets to the hospital. But it's almost like it wants to take that post-climax break and release that tension, when the tension should be as high as it's possibly been when he's going to the hospital. And then they bring that back when he gets to the hospital, but then they play a little too much with the different outcomes of how he thinks this is going to go down. Because in the book, it's constantly terrifying, because it's a real feeling we've all had, where we anticipate the worst. And I can appreciate them taking, a bit of a comedic approach, where the doctor says, like, oh, she's a vegetable, she's fucked. Or, oh, yeah, she died immediately. I think the director, Garris, is the first doctor. The one that just straight up says, oh, yeah, she died. But I feel like that's sort of taking away from the true terror in this moment. Like, that's something they really probably should have tried to hold on to, regardless of the we could have left the campiness behind at about the time he leaves the park and goes to the hospital. Though there is that one moment of terror when he sees George get on the elevator, but then it's by that point you start to wonder if it's really... Because he does come to the conclusion later that George was basically just sort of teasing him and almost making him appreciate the leftover time that he was ultimately going to have. But it's still, there does feel like the balance kind of goes off here a little bit, and one of the sides kind of slants. But then once he does get up there and we do get this sort of epilogue with his mom up until her death, are some really great scenes that are built up through the flashbacks in the movie. And I like the fact that the flashbacks are there to kind of set up the relationship between them and the, you know, on and off ways about it. But there was also the whole opening credit sequence gives us this story, and it's like that's usually a clever way to do it, is to just tell all the backstory in this sort of wordless way through montage and music and all this stuff, and that's what the opening credit sequence does. But then that's almost devoid of its entire existence when every scene we saw in quick succession in the opening credits gets its own individual scene, and it makes because we already know, because we got the gist of it through that the flashbacks start to feel tiresome. And it's like, there are a couple that are still necessary, probably, but there's also some that are a bit, maybe they're too long, maybe that could be it, like sort of padding the runtime a little bit. But they really, like, hammer in a lot of the points, so there is that. But for the most part, I do like the way they tried to take the ideas that King had in the story and were able to bring them to life in the way that they did. And then, well, like I said, also kind of almost feels like they're going for that sort of psychedelic thing by setting it in the late 60s also. Then there's also stuff like the dog attack in the middle of the movie, which is another thing that he sort of hallucinates, and once again, the evil of the night and all that, but I don't know. We get bombarded with a lot of stuff in this movie, when the points are made, and whether it be the flashbacks or the horror stuff. We get a little too much of both. I feel like reining it in on both of those just a little bit would have added a whole other, like the poignancy of the movie would have really hit a lot harder. And in the horror stuff too, really, when you don't bombard us with, like, dragging the rednecks out for too long, or dragging out the dog attack for too long, or whatever. Really, like I said, the story, just the way it narrows it down to the ride with the old man, then the ride with George, and then the epilogue of sorts, when he actually spends the time with his mom. After all those dreaded moments of did he or did he not kill her by handing her off to George, pretty much. Yeah, so, and then the way they use the last line of the book is also the last line of the movie, the take your button and get out of here, which is very interesting because it's two totally different contexts, where in the movie it's him saying to George almost bitterly, you know, take the button and get the fuck out of here. But in the book, it's the whole thing of basically I guess the pointlessness of life once we get to that point, because it is talking about, you know, living all those happy moments we can possibly get, especially with the ones that we love, but then ultimately when all is said and done, his mom's whole catchphrase that's repeated throughout the story, what is it, fun is fun and done is done, stuff like that. And then it's basically saying, you did it, you played your part in life, now take the button because you rode the ride and be on your way. And the way they put those into totally different contexts are really interesting also. So, yeah, I guess that's about it. So like I said, when you really look at the meat of the story, there is something here that really hits that part of you, the stuff that we're so afraid of that we probably don't talk about very much, but is the fear that's always in there. I said as we get older also, and as these years come on, it's like they're just going faster and faster, and I feel like I have an existential crisis at least a few times a week. Ever since I turned 20, it's been a problem. And I know it's probably only going to get worse, and that's why stories like this can really, really hit home, even if they may be disguised as some almost B-horror movie concept, which is also good in itself. So, yeah, so I think that's going to be this one. I guess we're going to go back to TV. I don't know if it's going to be... It might be another Tales from the Dark Side episode. It might be from the Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries. I don't know. We'll figure something out. Probably the Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries, actually. So, and then we have more verses coming, and whatever happens with reviews, I don't know. But we'll figure it out. So until the next one of those, that's it for